Narlikar, we're delighted to have you here, and I'll introduce you now briefly. Amrita Narlikar is the president of the German Institute for Global and Area Studies and professor at Hamburg University. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Amrita's expertise lies in the areas of multilateralism, international negotiation, WTO, and India. Her most recent book has been published by Cambridge University Press on poverty narratives in international trade negotiations and beyond in 2020. And some of her previous books include Bargaining with the Rising India. I'm sure you're familiar with that book as well, published in 2014, and the Oxford Handbook on the World Trade Organization in 2012. The policy relevance of her research brings Amrita into frequent and close exchanges with practitioners. She has authored several policy briefs for the Munich Security Times, the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, the CG, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and others, and has had an expertise cited in a range of media outlets. So Professor Narlikar, I'll just leave you the floor now.
Okay, thank you very much, Raphaëlle, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to all of you for organizing this, and especially Chris and Hannes and Nicholas and Raphaëlle and the team. This is such an exciting initiative, and I am very happy to be a part of it. Thank you for inviting me to contribute. So I was thinking, like, in the spirit of what Chris said, to really have a setting for frank exchange, for informal exchange, for good feedback, constructive feedback together. I thought what would be fun is if I actually presented a paper that is still a work in progress. And I would love to have your comments and suggestions on this. And I will be talking today on a paper that I'm developing, and it's on India's foreign economic policy under Modi, negotiations and narratives in the WTO. And in the short time that I have, I will just try and flesh out the argument, but I'm very happy to discuss particular examples later on and empirical evidence for this later on. But the main argument first. So for all the complexities of India's politics, Prime Minister Narendra Modi seemed to have had his economic path cut out for him. So you all remember his election campaign of 2014, which was Achhe Din Aane Wale Hain. And this Achhe Din campaign had won him a resounding victory. And what that suggested at the time was that Modi's primary goal was going to be growth and development for his country and people, and therefore also an agenda of economic reform. So focusing specifically on India's negotiations in the context of the WTO, I argue in this paper that India has continued to actually hold on to its former trade policy priorities and negotiation positions, and in fact adopted even more hardline positions in some cases. Interestingly though, the same policy priorities and the same negotiation patterns that had ill-served India in the past may actually no longer be a liability. And this is only partly a credit to the Modi administration per se. Rather, I would argue it is mainly due to the rise of the phenomenon called weaponized interdependence. Henry Farrell and Abe Newman have been doing really interesting work. They've coined the term weaponized interdependence, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the course of my presentation. But my argument is that the phenomenon of weaponized interdependence legitimizes, sometimes even necessitates, the securitization of foreign economic policy, and more specifically trade politics. And taken in this changing context, and if it plays its cards right, India's historic, its historic and often reviled, often deeply criticized caution in opening up its markets and reluctance to integrate in global value chains may yet allow India to have the last laugh. So now I will proceed in 4 steps. First, I will start off by highlighting the successes, the achievements of the Modi regime, and also the limitations. After this, I want to suggest that an overlooked but important explanation for the differential performance, why the regime has been successful in some areas and not in others, lies in the field of narratives. And so in the second step of my argument, I will just give you a brief theoretical overview of the concept and posit that the most significant changes occurred in areas where the government has constructed new and winning narratives. Then in the third step, I'll talk about Modi's foreign economic policy within the context of the WTO and compare it to previous eras. And we see a remarkable set of continuity, not only between what the Modi government has been doing in the WTO itself in comparison to the pre-Modi years, but I would say the pre-Modi decades. And in the fourth section, I will just offer an explanation for the persistence of India's old trade narrative, and indeed its hardening in some instances. And I will argue that a major factor lies in the international and regional context typified by this phenomenon of weaponized interdependence that legitimizes old narratives of protectionism and strengthens them further. So far, that's okay. Are there any questions, or you're happy for me to proceed in these 4 steps? There are also policy implications of the argument that I'm outlining. I want to use the expertise here to actually focus more on the theoretical argument and also the fundamentals. But I'm very happy to discuss the policy implications of this too in Q&A if this is interesting. Okay, so first the record. And when Modi came to power, he did so amidst high expectations that he was going to be an agent of economic reform. And to his credit, to the government's credit, there are a few successes. So for example, in its first term, the Modi government had taken on some challenging tasks, including the introduction of a goods and services tax, seen as too hot a potato by previous governments. The government set up 355 million Indians with bank accounts for the first time. It had several important campaigns like the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan that built close to 100 million toilets. It had the Jan Arogya Yojana, which aimed for universal healthcare and had reached 1.8 million people by the end of Modi's first term. In the services sector, always a strength of the Indian economy, but this sector really leapfrogged in the last years, offering smooth and swift visa services, passport services for its own citizens, ease of digital payments for retail purposes, and so forth. And then there was the promise of less government, more governance that you'll remember from the BJP's manifesto. And that seemed to be paying off in terms of India's improving attractiveness for investors. So after those years of having occupied embarrassingly low ranks in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, India jumped up a remarkable 65 places under Modi. So these are pretty important achievements. But then there were misses, and then there were actual failures. So demonetization produced massive disruption. Agriculture remains a very difficult area. Annual growth in this sector fell to less than 3% between 2014 and 19. And there's recognition that if India is to attain the high growth rates that it aspires to, productivity in a sector that occupies over 50% of its population will have to increase. So agriculture, they have to do something about agriculture, and they haven't managed very much yet. Manufacturing, that's the other big problem. Manufacturing is recognized as critical to growth, but remains beset with problems ranging from antiquated labor laws and land acquisition laws and so forth. And all these problems, of course, translate into India's trading positions, trade negotiation positions. And The Economist last year summarized India's position on trade with a short and damning verdict on the Modi government's record in the first term. And what it said was, rather than promoting trade, it scrapped existing bilateral deals, raised tariffs, and sparred with the WTO. So that's the record. That's the first step of my argument. Now I come to the second part, which is narratives and how they influence foreign economic policy. So the limitations that I just pointed to, of course, these relate to difficulties in carrying out deep structural economic reform. That is to be expected. The federal system exacerbates the complexities of implementing GST. Modernization of land acquisition laws and rationalization of small holdings is difficult for many reasons, including the fact that these issues come loaded with histories of colonial and post-colonial land acquisition and deprivation. Changes in labor laws have been the bête noire for many previous governments as well. Improvements in infrastructure to facilitate a manufacturing boost and a second agricultural revolution in any case do not happen overnight, or even over a single term of any ambitious government. So that's my saying foreign economic policy, it's complicated. Yes, it is complicated, but trade should be a little bit different. Not that it's uncomplicated, but it should be different. We would expect a growth-oriented government to use an organization like the WTO to readily embrace binding tariff commitments and thereby not only offer predictability to trading partners, but also lock in the reform process. So it's a signaling device. You want to show you're committed, you tie your hands in the WTO. Then, by working through an institution like the WTO, countries can secure the gains of unilateral trade liberalization that mainstream economics advocates by tying their hands. But because it's multilateral trade liberalization, you also get access to the markets of others. And this allows the mobilization of export-oriented interest groups. And this can help balance them out against competing protectionist interest groups, which we all know are many in the Indian case too. So a government pushing for reform can even use the cognate international organization to shift the blame for the tough measures that it needs to adopt. For example, the WTO and mandatory protection of intellectual property rights that it demands from its members. In fact, this is not how the reform process is played out in India. Even while successfully bringing about some important policy changes, which have a positive impact on the economic lives of its people, the Modi government has not played the two-level game to its advantage. And there are several explanations as to why the government has achieved success in some areas and not in others. An important one, and usually an overlooked explanation, is that of narratives. So there's this burgeoning field of narrative economics. And Robert Schiller, I'm using his definition, he calls a narrative, and I quote, "A simple story or easily expressed explanation of events that many people want to bring up in conversation or on news or social media because it can be used to stimulate the concerns or emotions of others and or because it appears to advance self-interest. Narratives don't have to be true or false. They are supposed to provide accessible explanations and legitimation for governments to carry out specific policies, and to also convince their electorates to abide by them. In some sectors, Modi has clearly marked out his terrain as an agent of transformation, and he has developed corresponding narratives. So a nice example of this was in the area of climate change. In this issue area, Modi developed a powerful green narrative by appealing to ancient Indian traditions. He thereby helped make mitigation and adaptation measures palatable at home. And he also ensured that India could show unprecedented and constructive leadership in the negotiations over the Paris Agreement, in a break with some of its past negotiating behaviors. Similarly, by developing pro-poverty alleviation narratives, the Modi government was able to bring about reform that visibly and positively affects the lives of its citizens. And it did this by appealing not only to a diffused national interest, not only that it's good for the country, but also by targeting the concerns of multiple groups affected by poverty. So for example, minorities, women, the extremely poor category of people, in terms of food security, specific backward districts, and more. And what this ended up doing was it helped unite a diverse set of possibly competing interests of political economy in support for implementing the agenda. Plus, it produced nice synergies in the areas of business. So for example, the linkage of Aadhaar card numbers with bank accounts, facilitating business transactions via mobile apps. So we have examples of narratives that the Modi government has developed and they've worked. On trade though, things were different. That same manifesto of the BJP, the 2014 manifesto, which had shown a great deal of economic ambition, was in fact also the manifesto that promised to put India first. Now, this is a different version of the country first from Trump. And again, I'm happy to discuss this later. But the narrative was certainly not one of reducing protectionism. It said that the government, if the party came to power, the government would pay attention to several important goals, such as cutting red tapeism. But it also stated clearly, and I quote, "We should no longer remain a market for the global industry. Rather, we should become a global manufacturing hub. A strong manufacturing sector will not only bridge the demand-supply gap, leading to price stabilization, but also create millions of jobs and increase incomes for the working class." And this is one of the interesting lines here. "Above all, it will increase the revenue for government and lead to import substitution to bring down the import bill." And these tendencies continued. It's not difficult to see some clear protectionist strains in Modi's Make in India campaign. And amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, Modi's narrative has taken an even more defensive and an even more old-fashioned turn. For instance, the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan refers explicitly to self-reliance, reminiscent very much of ideas of self-sufficiency that had in fact been propagated by Jawaharlal Nehru. New narratives, therefore, of infusing dynamism in certain aspects of the Indian economy, so for example, the emphasis on economic freedom, have been accompanied by alternative and old-fashioned narratives of self-reliance and protectionism. And it's these latter types of narratives that appear most explicitly in India's negotiating positions in the WTO. And there are three things that I just want to flag up in terms of India's negotiating positions in the WTO. So the first is India continues to use a strict distributive strategy, which means it's reluctant, very reluctant sometimes to make concessions towards others. It does make demands from others. It frequently describes issue areas and treats them as non-negotiable, right? That word appears in a negotiation setting and it's seen as very distributive, especially in the WTO setting. Second interesting thing that's happening in the WTO is that India works in coalitions. And you know that Dr. Jayashankar has repeatedly pointed to the pragmatism of India's foreign policy, that India is no longer so much wedded in the same way. We get the impression to non-alignment. That's probably true. But you look at coalitions in the WTO, and India still makes common cause with developing countries, sometimes very productively, arguing the case of the poor and the weak, sometimes lesser so. For example, it makes the case for special and differential treatment, something that the US has really been complaining about pre-Trump. Under Trump, special and differential treatment has come under extremely severe critique. And China has been the main target of this critique. Now, if India were to just go with a smaller group of countries, developing countries, and make the case, it may get a better hearing. But in fact, it has also joined coalitions, formed coalitions with China, arguing for special and differential treatment. And then the third interesting thing about India's negotiating behavior in the WTO is the use of poverty narratives, where it repeatedly points to the condition of per capita of its own people, poverty within its nation, makes common cause with other countries making similar arguments. And sometimes this looks quite incongruous because on the one hand, many people are expecting India to play the role of the rising power. It is at the high table of negotiations. On the other hand, it's also making common cause over concerns of poverty. And these are real concerns of poverty, yeah? It's not, so I'm not passing judgment on the validity of the claim, I'm just pointing out the kind of narrative that India uses. And that narrative is also one which says, if we want to alleviate poverty, it's not enough to do economic reform from within, we need a reform of the system. And here we see a very, it's almost consistent. This is how India has argued its case in the GATT and in the WTO. The narrative has been, by changing the system, by changing the institutions, we will be able to alleviate poverty. Until we change the system, until we change the rules, India cannot open up its markets. That continuity has persisted also in the Modi regime, contra expectations. And other developing countries, for example, special and differential treatment, countries like Brazil or South Korea have indicated that they will give it up. They are willing to forego it in the interest of advancing negotiations in the WTO. But India has held on to its position that that SDT, special and differential treatment, is non-negotiable. So now I come to the last part of my argument. Why do we see such a persistent pattern in its narrative in the WTO, irrespective of changes in government, party, ideology, and changes in India's own power positions? And there are several explanations for such patterns, and they include bureaucratic politics, institutions, political economy types of explanations, entrenched interests, colonial legacies, and negotiation culture. It's also true that narratives of poverty and powerlessness, especially as India learned to use them around the turn of the millennium, did generate some good outcomes for India and other developing countries. So you could also argue that we see this is really policy inertia, that India continues to use a narrative because that narrative was not counterproductive in a certain phase of the Doha negotiations. But a key additional variable which we do need to take into account is the phenomenon of weaponized interdependence. So contra assumptions that had underpinned the post-war economic system, which associated growing economic integration with both prosperity and peace. The assumption was that if you get prosperity, you will also get peace. That was supposed to be the lesson of the interwar years. That is very much the narrative we can read about when we look at the Bretton Woods negotiations or even Havana Charter negotiations or the UN. That was the prior assumption that guided the system, has guided the system until now. But Henry Farrell and Abe Newman have identified the phenomenon of weaponized interdependence. And what they argue is that the global production of goods and services via integrated value chains generates hierarchical economic networks. States which hold political authority over network hubs are able to weaponize these networks of interdependence to their advantage. So the assumption, the world is flat assumption was, there are all these beautiful horizontal networks and they will equalize. And what Farrell and Newman are saying, no, that's not true, because state power goes with these networks and only some states are able to weaponize them. And while we've seen and they talk about mechanisms for this, panopticon effects, choke point effects. And what they say is states that are located on network hubs can discover and exploit vulnerabilities, compel policy change, and deter unwanted actions. And while we've seen these pernicious effects in the past, for example, China's export controls on rare earth minerals, the COVID-19 pandemic drove home these risks with unprecedented urgency. So we saw the weaponization of global value chains. And it was not just India that saw this happening. We saw this happening in Europe. We saw this happening across the world. And we're still seeing this in action. And so the really interesting thing to observe is India's narrative has not changed in the WTO. But what has changed is that the world has begun to look quite different. India has incorporated a further reason for exercising greater restraint in market opening without abandoning its earlier arguments or protecting its own poor. But in a world where many countries are trying to adapt to weaponized interdependence, India's narrative no longer looks quite as anachronistic. So recall, for instance, India's demands with reference to food security as part of the agricultural negotiations in the Doha negotiations. Now, many countries besides India are expressing similar concerns in relation to food security or health security or security of communications and infrastructure sectors. And taken in this new context, in this context of weaponized interdependence, India's previous resistance to the old form of globalization now begins to look almost pioneering. So to conclude, India's narrative has not changed in the Modi era, which of course suggests the limitations of Modi's own reformist agenda. But the world has changed so much that some of India's old narratives have acquired new relevance. And there are many policy implications of this, which I'd be happy to discuss further if you like in Q&A. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I personally learned a lot, and I didn't know the concept of weaponized interdependence. So that was really, really an interesting talk. Thank you very much. maybe I shall open the Q&A now. I had a few questions, but I'll first leave everyone else ask questions, and I'll get back to my own questions later on. So whoever would like to ask a question can raise their hand in the, on the side of the screen.
To use the virtual raise hand option, you have to go click on participants, and then on the lower right, you'll see a virtual raise hand option. There we go. Sorry.
Yeah, Kate, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I'm just struggling with technology as always. Let me put my video on so I'm not so anonymous. Hi, so I'm Kate Sullivan de Strada, based at the University of Oxford. Hi, Amrita.
Hello, good to see you.
You too. So this is a question about this external context and the nature of weaponized interdependence, because I mean, I have no familiarity with the concept at all. I was just kind of Googling the paper as you spoke. But I wonder, you know, in a way, these kinds of analyses of the inequalities of economic interactions only tend to come into play when they affect kind of major countries. So there's probably a wider politics as to why mainstream IPE scholars are starting to pick out this idea of weaponized interdependence. But my question would be, how on what case studies and on what countries does the development of this theory rest? Because for many developing countries, interdependence has always been weaponized. You know, we know from, say, Cardoso's dependency development theories, or from Andre Frank's, you know, the underdevelopment of development, that there's a very strong kind of global self narrative of how interdependence is weaponized. So I wonder if this is really something new, or if it's simply become more salient in mainstream conversations in the global north, and whether, you know, India's policies haven't adapted actually to this external situation at all, because it's always been sort of weaponized by some party or other.
So maybe we'll take a round of questions, and then, so I think Christian Wagner had a question. So Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for a wonderful and comprehensive presentation. I have one question. You mentioned in the beginning that India would have the last laugh on these new developments. And I was wondering, listening to your presentation, in how far weaponized interdependence is not more a threat to India's economic outlook, because only a few countries will be able to have this form of weaponized interdependence. So I'm not really sure in how far, or I do not see you put it in a, let's say, positive way at the end. And I would, from your outline, rather have a negative perception on it. Okay, so it's much more it's a much bigger challenge, and not to say it's a nightmare. Okay, because you will not be able, or it's extremely difficult to compete in areas of weaponized interdependence if you want to develop your country and become more important on the global level. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can start with these two big questions, and then.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions. I'll just order them in. I'll just answer them in the order that they were posed. So first to Kate, and this is a great question, and your hunch is spot on. The theory is based on they look at the US and they say a little bit about China, right? And that's where those are the hubs, those are the hub countries, according to the argument. Where I would argue, and sorry, and one more thing about their project, there's a bigger project that the paper has spawned a whole lot of other papers and projects. And there's a new project that's coming out with Brookings, in which they asked me to focus, Dan Dresner and Henry Farrell and Abe Newman asked me to focus specifically on the global South. Sort of the weapons of the weak type of argument. How do you deal in a world of weaponized interdependence, exactly for the kinds of problems that Christian Wagner was just outlining, right? So they want to see how far this applies, the theory applies, how far it's useful. I would argue that it's true, there were a lot of dependencies, right? It was often not interdependence that the third world, the global South, was dealing with. It was dependence, or it was asymmetric interdependence. That is true, right? And in that sense, you could argue that there's not much that's new here. But I actually am persuaded with the mechanisms that Farrell and Newman are outlining. And those mechanisms have to do with the changes in production pattern. And the changes in production pattern that we are seeing as a result of the deep integration that comes from the higher level of globalization that we did achieve in the past, right? The assumption was we would get more integration will lead to more peace. We like globalization, we like integration. There was a post-Cold War triumphalism. But as a result of this, we get an integration of global value chains. And this is what leads to the creation of these hubs, which are completely different from just being an exporter of one product and my importing another product from another economy. And that intricacy of relationship makes it very difficult for countries to disengage from that. You can't turn to alternatives easily. And so in that sense, I think this is a new concept, and it is, and we saw it happening in terms of access to medicines, not in the TRIP sense, but recently in the pandemic, and the concerns about API content that comes from China, and what would happen to India if China denied it that access, and so forth, right? So that is all about the integration of global value chains. And it relates, and the fact that states control these hubs, right? So it's not just private power, it's an interaction of the private and the state. That makes it interesting and new and surprising. I actually think we need more on the global South on this, and that's why I've been getting into this topic more. Also because it allows us to build a more dynamic model of weaponized interdependence. Because now I'm getting into my response to Christian's question. It's not that these countries are just victims. So we've, for example, have seen some countries like Vietnam, like Bangladesh, make use of the trade war between China and the US, right? And so in my paper for this Brookings project, I talk about the different kinds of strategies that seemingly weak countries can adopt to both combat becoming victims of weaponized interdependence, but also use it themselves. And you see this play out in regional settings too. My point about the last laugh, Christian, I agree with you. This is a very dangerous world. It's a much more dangerous world than it was in the 90s, especially for developing countries that are not located on hubs. So I share that concern with you. When I said India might have the last laugh, by that I actually meant that India's narrative of we don't want to open up our markets, it's very dangerous, we want special and differential treatment, all that skepticism that India used to express now suddenly looks much more legitimate than it did before, and other countries are using it too. The US is using it, right? The EU is using it. So I meant it in that sense, that India has the last laugh on the narrative. All that critique that it got, now major powers are also using it. And what I think we are going to end up, it depends on how negotiations work out between different countries, how countries react. But in terms of the real threat that it poses, again, back to what Christian was saying, weaponized interdependence poses a threat, but it also offers opportunities, right? Because we're now seeing a debate on shortening of global value chains, right? I have colleagues at ORF like Samir Saran who are talking about gated globalization. Now that could be an opportunity. So the biggest risk that I now see comes not from weaponized interdependence actually for India, but the risk that India goes to the old form of self-sufficiency, autonomy, right? Self-reliance. Because if that happens, then we will lose 30 years of progress, right? And this will be devastating for India, for all those people who need to be rising out of poverty, right? So, and there is a risk that that might happen because the world is looking inwards. So a lot also depends in my eyes in how the EU reacts, right? And whether India and the EU can work together, whether Japan and India can work together, new types of new chains of globalization will need to be forged, and it will have to be done very slowly, right? It can't happen overnight, but it has to be done. And if there are not these opportunities available, then I think we risk getting very nationalistic reactions, and not only from India, from other countries too.
Thank you, Christian. You have the floor. I think, Christian, you're...
Yeah. Okay, so sorry. Amrita, just a short follow-up. If I overstretch your argument, it would end up in this saying poverty is going to last in India for many years to come. Okay?
Go on. I don't agree with that, but yeah,
yes.
Go on.
Okay. Second point: in how far does this the narrative you mentioned about the system, the international trading system has to change so that we can overcome poverty? In how far is this also already mentioned in for instance election campaigns? So does it resonate on the domestic level?
Okay. So to the second one, no. Trade policy usually in India is not one that you see appearing in a big way, right? In contrast, for example, to the US, right? So, and I think that's because there is such an immediacy of domestic economic reform. That's what they focus on. And so you get relevant things, trade relevant ideas. So for example, securing supply chains within the country, right? Improving infrastructure within the country, having a single window investor approach in the country. These are all trade related, but it's not in that systemic way that this appears. I think it's seen as too far removed from the electorate. But in terms of India will be stuck in to decades of great poverty. I mean, of course, you know, we're seeing the terrible effects of the COVID pandemic, right? And so everybody is going to get hit by this. If we get an insular India emerging from this, then I would say, yes, we will get the scenario that you described. But it's so far from inevitable that we will get that scenario, because now for the first time, we see Margrethe Vestager, for example, saying we need to be protecting our investment, we need to be checking investment that comes into EU, right? I mean, we're seeing other major players also going in that direction of shortening value chains. So there may be new opportunities. Having said all that, if you get decoupling, of course, the world is going to be less prosperous. It's going to happen, right? Nobody's going to be as prosperous. This also affects India. There will be a trade-off there is a trade-off happening between security and economics, right? And that is the trade-off of weaponized interdependence. So if India plays its cards right, but it's not just India, it will be a negotiation with the EU, with other like-minded players. If they do it right, there will still be lesser growth, but it will be a more secure and sustainable growth. And in that sense, I think that's no bad thing, right? I mean, look at the kind of conflict that we've seen in the last few weeks on India's borders and how dangerous that region is. So in that sense, greater security, slightly slower, but more maybe slower but sustainable growth could actually work out, but it depends on other players too.
Thank you very much. I had a few questions as well. If anyone else, so I'll ask my questions then. I was interested in your very quick comparison of the narrative of India first and the US first. And it seems that one of the paradox here is that in the case of India, it seems that India is perceived as one of the main players of a renewed multilateralism, at least by the EU, while the US seems to be obviously going towards a withdrawal, and the US first narrative expresses that. So how would you compare these two, India first, US first narrative and the relation to multilateralism?
Sort of the Trump's America First narrative, right, is very explicitly targeted at outsiders. So it's about, we want to bring back jobs to America, right? The reason why Americans are unhappy and poor is because of the external problem. The India First narrative, at least in the BJP's, when I came across it the first time, was in that BJP manifesto in 2014. And there it's not framed in terms of the outside in India. It's framed more in terms of India, all Indians working together. We should not be divided by caste, class, etc., etc. This is India first, the nation first, right? So the target looks different. But having said that, I'm not making the claim here that India under Modi is not going to be protectionist, right? It's, of course, we've seen a rise in protectionism across many G20 countries, and India is one of them. But just in terms of the extreme othering that we see from the US, and then the support that builds up in the US for trade wars are good and easy to win, right? That's very different in comparison to India.
Thank you very much. And well, if I can ask a last question, you were talking about the policy implications. I mean, so the concept of weaponized interdependence was very interesting, and you were saying that it's rising either because of some actors using it, and I suppose China is one of the good examples, or the COVID is increasing that issue. How do you see concretely the policy implications of that for India's trade policy, considering that it has a good narrative compared to other states, but that it would probably still have to adapt its policy?
That's a very good question. And I would sort of pick up a little bit on what I was also responding to Christian Wagner's questions, right? Because it's the policy implications of this, in my eyes, are India had a narrative that had expressed much concern about the system. It had done it mainly in terms of poverty, but that suspicion was there. Now there is an additional reason, which is weaponized interdependence. Other countries are also very concerned about weaponized interdependence. So in terms of policy implications, the first most obvious one would be, here's room for alliance building, right? So your country and my country, I'm always confused about my identity. So France and Germany. France and Germany, the Alliance for Multilateralism, right? That is one such initiative. But right now, the Alliance for Multilateralism is really, it's got a menu-based approach. It doesn't exclude anybody. It's not really about dealing with weaponized interdependence. But it could be if they recognize the opportunity that India now presents it, right? And again, what I think is really interesting is now India is not that alone in expressing that skepticism. And India itself could make more of it, right? India itself could be making more of shortening those global value chains. It can't do it very explicitly because of its heavy dependence on China right now, right? And so India is walking a real tightrope. But the more allies it gets, the easier it would become for India and other allies. So I think it could, if it's played well, it could be a really exciting time for policy. If it goes wrong, it will go horribly wrong.
That's nice to finish on a positive line, because it's not a common thing these days. So, Thank you very much. And if there's no other question, then I think we should just thank Amrita very much again for her fascinating talk. I don't know if we clap hands in, but thank you very much again for your intervention.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.